Ignore the 3D mental reality. How does that sound to you? Unrealistic? Maybe even a little dangerous? Because 3D is the reality we deal with every day. Space, objects, the body, distance, circumstances. Your bills are real. Your history is real. Your body has limits. Music. Other people make choices you cannot control. So why would anyone tell you to ignore 3D reality? Ignoring it does not mean denying it. It means refusing to let what is visible right now become the final definition of what is possible next. And that is where this video is going. We are going to understand what people mean by 3D, 4D, and 5D, where those ideas belong to physics, where they become metaphors for consciousness, and why the difference actually matters in your music daily life. Joe Dispenza's book, Becoming Supernatural, will be one of our reference points, especially when we talk about attention, familiar emotions, and the way identity can keep recreating the same patterns. But the real question is more personal than that. How much of your future are you unconsciously deciding by looking at your present? Because maybe you are not trapped in reality. Maybe you are, music, trapped in the interpretation you keep repeating about it. And if that interpretation can change, then your relationship with reality can change too. So stay with me until the end of this video, because by the time we reach 5D, you won't just understand the difference between 3D, 4D, and 5D. You'll be able to recognize when your current reality is simply giving you information and when your mind is quietly turning that information into a limit. And once you see that difference, you can begin making choices from who you are becoming instead of from what has already happened. The easiest way to understand what we are calling 3D reality, music, is not through a physics textbook. It is through an ordinary morning. You wake up in the same room, reach for the same phone, see the same messages, music, remember the same responsibilities, and before the day has properly begun. Music. Your mind has already reconstructed a familiar version of you. There is nothing mystical about that. Your brain is constantly using previous experience to interpret what is happening now. It compares, predicts, filters, and decides what deserves attention. That efficiency is useful. Without it, every morning would feel like arriving on Earth for the first time. But there is a hidden cost. The same mechanism that helps you recognize your world can also make it difficult to see beyond the version of life you already know. This is where the phrase "ignore 3D reality" begins to make more sense. The visible world gives you information, but the mind immediately adds meaning to that information. A relationship ends, and the fact is that a relationship ended. Then another layer appears. People always leave me. A business struggles, and the situation is real. Then the conclusion arrives. I am not someone who succeeds. You look in the mirror and notice age, fatigue, or change, and within seconds an entire story about who you are becoming may follow. The event and the interpretation can feel almost identical because they happen so quickly. Yet psychologically they are not the same thing. One is what occurred. The other is what your nervous system, memory, and identity learned to make it mean. Joe Dispenza often speaks about the familiar self as a pattern built from repeated thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and reactions. You do not need to accept every philosophical conclusion around his work to recognize the practical insight underneath it. Music. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity can begin to feel like identity. Neuroscience gives us a more grounded language for part of this process. The brain changes through experience. Neural pathways that are used, music, repeatedly can become easier to activate, while expectations influence what we notice and how we interpret ambiguous situations. In other words, your past does not simply sit behind you as a collection of memories. Parts of it are actively participating in the way you read the present. And this is why someone can enter a completely new situation and still create a very old emotional experience. New city, new partner, new opportunity, different faces, different circumstances. Yet somehow the same fear returns, the same defensiveness, the same hesitation before speaking, the same need for approval. The scenery, music, changed, but the observer carried the old map with them. This is one reason personal change can become frustrating. We assume that changing the external conditions should automatically produce a different inner life. Sometimes it does, but often the mind takes the new environment and quietly reorganizes it around familiar expectations. It is not because you secretly want to suffer. It is because the nervous system prefers what it can predict, even when what it can predict is uncomfortable. So when we say you may be trapped in your interpretation of reality, this is what we mean. You see a circumstance, but you also see everything your history has taught you to expect from that circumstance. Music, and unless you notice the difference, the interpretation begins influencing the next decision. You avoid the conversation. You postpone the idea. You assume the opportunity is not for someone like you. Then the result seems to confirm the original belief. The circle closes. What began as an interpretation now looks like evidence. This is how a temporary condition can slowly become a personal definition. But something important happens when you can observe that process without immediately obeying it. There is a small interval between what is music happening and the meaning you give it. At first, that interval may be almost invisible. Yet, it is precisely there that another possibility begins to appear. You can acknowledge the facts without turning them into prophecy. You can feel an old reaction without making it your instruction. You can notice the voice that says, "This always happens," and ask a much quieter question. Does it have to happen this way again? That question is our bridge out of the purely familiar world. Not because asking it transports you to another physical dimension, but because it introduces something 3D circumstances, music, cannot provide on their own, possibility before evidence. And this is where the conversation about 4D becomes far more interesting. Music, because the next dimension we need to examine is not simply more space. Music, it changes the role of time itself. If 3D gives us the world we can measure in space, then 4D introduces something we cannot hold in our hands, time. In physics, this is not a mystical idea. Modern relativity describes reality as spacing, where the three dimensions of space are inseparable from time. An event is never defined only by where it happens, but also by when. A meeting, a birth, a decision, a collision, a sunset. Every event belongs to a position in space and a position in time. That may sound abstract, but it opens an important door for our conversation because human beings do something remarkable with time every day. Music. We do not experience only what is physically in front of us. We remember what is gone. Music. Anticipate what has not happened. Rehearse conversations. Construct futures. Music. Revisit losses and emotionally respond to events that exist. Music. Nowhere in the room around us. Think about what happens when you remember a painful moment from 20 years ago. The room may be quiet. Nothing threatening is happening. Yet, your breathing changes. Your jaw tightens. Your body reacts to an event that is not physically present. Now reverse music it. You are waiting for an important result next week and begin imagining everything that could go wrong again. The event has not happened. Still, your nervous system starts preparing for it. Music. This tells us something essential about human experience. Our biology does not respond exclusively to the immediate environment. Memory and imagination can participate in our present state. This is where Dispenza's work becomes useful as a reference. One of the recurring ideas in Becoming Supernatural is that when people repeatedly think from familiar memories and feel the emotions associated with them, the past can continue shaping the present. The scientific language around memory prediction and nervous system responses is more nuanced. But the practical question remains powerful. How much of what you feel today belongs to what is actually happening? And how much belongs to a time your mind is carrying into this moment? Now we can begin to understand why spiritual traditions borrowed the language of 4D and gave it another meaning. In those circles, 4D is often described as the realm of imagination, inner states, possibilities, or the unseen stage before something becomes visible in life. That is not the same claim physics makes about the fourth dimension, and keeping those meanings separate matters. But as a metaphor, it points toward a genuine human capacity. You can mentally represent something before it exists in your immediate environment. An architect can walk through a building in the mind before the foundation is poured. A musician can hear a melody before anyone else has heard it. You can rehearse a difficult conversation, envision a different response, or conceive of a version of yourself that your current music circumstances do not yet confirm. None of this guarantees that imagination will magically produce an external event. What it can do is change the internal conditions from which perception, behavior, music, attention, and decisions emerge. This is the first practical advantage of moving beyond what we have been calling the 3D mental reality. You stop demanding visible proof before allowing yourself to consider a different response. Suppose your current life tells you you have always avoided conflict. A purely familiar interpretation says that this is simply who you are. But the mind can enter a different relationship with time. Instead of asking only what have I done before, you can ask how would I like to respond the next time this happens. That question sounds almost too music simple, yet it moves attention away from identity as historical evidence and toward identity as something that can be practiced. The future is no longer merely something approaching you. It becomes something you can prepare yourself to meet differently, and preparation matters because imagination is not transformation by itself. You can picture a calmer life every night and still repeat the same reaction every morning. The real shift occurs when an inner possibility begins to influence what you do when reality pushes music back. This is where many spiritual explanations become too convenient. They tell people to live in the end, but skip the uncomfortable moment when the old pattern is triggered. Yet that moment is where change becomes visible. Can you hold a new intention when the familiar emotion returns? Can you recognize an old conclusion before it becomes another decision? Can you imagine a different future without pretending the present does not exist? That is a much more demanding practice than positive thinking. It asks you to remain in contact with reality, music, without allowing reality to dictate your identity. So 4D for our purposes becomes a bridge. In physics, it reminds us that reality cannot be described without time. Music. In human experience, it reminds us that we are constantly moving psychologically between memory, present perception, and anticipation. And in spiritual language, it becomes a metaphor for the unseen possibilities we can hold, music, before they have external evidence. The value is not in pretending these three meanings are identical. The value is in seeing what they reveal when placed beside each other. Music, your present circumstances are only one source of information. They tell you where you are. They do not automatically tell you what you are capable of becoming. But there is still a problem. You can imagine 10 different futures and remain controlled, music, by the same person imagining them. You can visualize freedom while still observing everything through fear. You can create new possibilities mentally while carrying an identity that quietly rejects every one of them. So something deeper has to change than the picture in your mind. And that is where the idea of 5D enters the conversation. This is where the language of 5D becomes both fascinating and easy to misuse. In some spiritual communities, 5D is described as a higher state of consciousness associated with unity, expanded awareness, intuition, or freedom from fear-based patterns. Physics does use mathematical models with additional dimensions in certain theories. But there is no scientific evidence that a person literally raises consciousness into a fifth physical dimension. So, we need to be clear. In this video, 5D becomes useful as a language for a different relationship with experience. Not another place you travel to, but a position from which you are no longer completely identified with every thought, emotion, and circumstance passing through you. There is a simple way to recognize this shift. You are music. Angry, and normally the sentence is I am angry. The emotion becomes the identity. But sometimes another awareness appears. There is anger in me right now. The emotion has not disappeared. Nothing has been suppressed. Yet something, music, has changed. There is now a small distance between the experience and the person observing it. Psychology calls related capacities metacognition, our ability to notice and reflect on our own mental processes. Meditation traditions have explored similar territory for centuries through practices of observing thoughts without immediately following them. Different traditions use different language, but they point toward an important human capacity. You can experience a mental state without allowing that state to become the complete definition of who you are. This matters because the observer is not neutral in the psychological sense. What you expect, fear, remember, and believe influences what captures your attention and how you interpret events. This should not be confused with the observer effect in quantum mechanics, where measurement has a specific physical meaning and does not establish that human thought creates whatever reality it desires. But there is still something deeply practical here. Two people can enter the same room, hear the same sentence, and leave with completely different experiences because each mind selected, interpreted, music, and connected the event to a different history. The external situation matters, but the lens matters, too. And until you see the lens, you may spend years trying to repair the world while unknowingly carrying the same interpretation into every new version of it. Carl Jung approached this from another direction when he explored the unconscious patterns that influence conscious life. What we refuse to recognize in ourselves does not simply vanish. It can continue shaping reactions, music, relationships, attractions, and conflicts outside our awareness. You may believe you are making a fresh decision when you are actually protecting an old wound. You may call something intuition when it is fear speaking with confidence. You may think another person has the power to make you feel insignificant when the deeper pain comes from a belief that existed long before they arrived. None of this means external events are imaginary or that other people cannot harm us. Music. It means that freedom increases when we can distinguish what belongs to the present from what our internal history is adding to it. Now bring this back to the 3 levels we have been building. In the 3D mental frame, you look at what is happening and conclude this is reality. Therefore, this is who I must be. In the 4D frame, you recognize that memory and imagination allow you to relate to time differently. You can rehearse another response, envision another possibility, and stop treating history as the only blueprint available. But what we are calling the 5D perspective asks an even deeper question. Who is the person imagining that future? If music, the image changes but the observer remains organized around shame, scarcity, resentment, or fear, music, then the new future may simply become another costume worn by the old identity. This is why some people spend years visualizing a different life while feeling strangely unchanged. Their images are new, but the emotional position from which they imagine them is not. They picture love while quietly asking to be rescued from loneliness. They imagine abundance while continually checking for proof that they are still unsafe. They envision confidence while mentally arguing with everyone who once made them feel small. The surface has moved forward in time, but the observer is still standing in the past, and eventually this becomes exhausting because the person begins trying to force the music, external world to confirm an internal transformation that has not fully occurred. A deeper shift sounds, music, quieter. Instead of asking, how do I make reality give me what I want? You begin, music, asking, what part of me believes I cannot be at peace until reality changes first? That question changes the direction of attention. You are no longer fighting the mirror. You are studying the one looking into it. This does not mean becoming passive. In fact, it can make action more precise. When fear is no longer automatically making the decision, you may finally have the conversation. When rejection is no longer interpreted as proof of your worth, you recover faster. When the past stops being treated as a prediction, unfamiliar opportunities become easier to recognize. And perhaps this is the most useful meaning of a higher dimension in ordinary life. Not rising above humanity, but gaining enough perspective to see the pattern while you are still inside it. The circumstance may remain unchanged for a while. The old emotion may still visit. The evidence around you may still look exactly as it did yesterday. Yet the person interpreting that evidence is beginning to change. And once that happens, ignoring 3D reality no longer sounds like denial. It begins to sound like refusing to let the visible world have the final word. There is a point in every real change where the old life is still visible, and the new way of being has not yet produced enough evidence to feel secure. This is where most people retreat. Not because the new direction is wrong, but because the nervous system prefers confirmation. It wants proof before commitment. It wants the environment to change first, the relationship to soften first, the opportunity to appear first, the body to feel different first. Only then, it says, well, I believe something new is possible. But if your identity is always waiting for external evidence before it moves, then the external world remains in charge of your internal state. This is the practical edge of everything we have been discussing. The 3D level says, I will respond to what is already here. The 4D level allows you to mentally represent another possibility before it appears. But the deeper, music, shift begins when you can remain connected to that possibility without demanding immediate reassurance from the world around you. Not with blind optimism. Music, not by pretending that difficult facts are pleasant. by learning to separate present conditions from permanent conclusions. A delayed result is not a verdict. A difficult season is not an identity. A familiar emotion is not an instruction. This distinction may sound small, but repeated over time, it changes the quality of your decisions. Consider someone who has spent years feeling overlooked. Perhaps they learned early that speaking openly led to criticism. So they became careful, agreeable, almost invisible. Years later, the original environment is gone. Yet the pattern remains. They enter meetings with good ideas and stay silent. They meet new people and immediately calculate how much of themselves is safe to reveal. Music. Then they look at the resulting life and say, "See, nobody really notices me." The conclusion appears to be supported by reality, music, but part of that reality has been shaped by a protective pattern that was never questioned. The transformation does not begin by standing in front of a mirror and declaring that everyone will suddenly value them. It begins at the next moment when silence feels familiar and they choose to speak anyway. That is what makes change uncomfortable. The new action often feels less natural than the old limitation. Familiarity is not the same thing as truth. Yet the body can confuse the two. A person may leave an unhealthy dynamic and feel strangely drawn back to it. Not because it was good, but because it was known. Someone may receive an opportunity they wanted for years and suddenly procrastinate because the identity required to step into it feels unfamiliar. This is why transformation sometimes feels like loss before it feels like expansion. You are not only learning a new behavior, music, you are loosening your loyalty to a version of yourself that once helped you survive. And this is where I want you to make this conversation personal. If one sentence could represent the shift we are exploring, let it be this: I choose beyond the familiar. If that feels true for you, write those 5 words in the comments. I choose beyond the familiar, not as a ritual that magically changes circumstances, but as a simple marker of awareness, a way of saying that the next decision does not have to be dictated by the oldest pattern in the room. Then watch what happens the next time life gives you contradictory evidence. Someone doubts you. A plan slows down. An old insecurity returns with the same convincing voice it has used for years. This is where the practice becomes real. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening again?" ask, "What is this situation inviting me to repeat?" That question interrupts the automatic loop. It moves you from reaction into observation. Sometimes the answer will be obvious. You are about to withdraw, apologize unnecessarily, catastrophize, control, please, avoid, or give up. Once you can see the pattern before acting it out, you have already created a different kind of space. This is also where the idea of a higher dimension becomes useful without becoming supernatural. Music, a higher perspective, is not one that makes problems disappear. It is one that contains more information than the reaction itself. When you are inside fear, fear looks like the whole world. When you observe fear, it becomes one element within a larger field of awareness. When you are inside an old story, every event seems to confirm it. When you can see the story as a story, alternatives become visible again. The situation has not necessarily changed, but the number of possible responses has increased. And with more possible responses comes more freedom. That freedom is the beginning of a new identity. Not because you invented a fictional version of yourself, but because you stopped reducing yourself to the evidence of your past. This is the part that cannot be outsourced to visualization, affirmations, or intellectual understanding. At some point, the person you want to become has to appear in behavior before the world has fully rewarded that behavior. You speak differently before confidence feels complete. You create boundaries, music, before everyone approves. You begin the work before certainty arrives. You respond from a wider perspective while the old interpretation is still asking to be believed. And once you understand that, another question emerges. If your experience changes when your interpretation changes, and your behavior changes when your identity changes, then what exactly are you accessing when people speak about 5D consciousness? The answer is not another location. It may be a different relationship with yourself. If all of this remains an interesting idea, nothing changes. The useful question is what you do with it on a Tuesday afternoon when something happens that immediately pulls you back into the old version of yourself. That is the real laboratory, not meditation alone, not visualization alone. The moment your circumstances provoke the exact response you have rehearsed for years. Someone ignores your message. A financial problem appears. Your body feels tired. A family member says something that touches an old wound. Within seconds, the mind begins assembling a familiar conclusion. This is where the distinction between reality and interpretation becomes practical, because you can learn to catch the process before the conclusion becomes behavior. Try something very simple the next time that happens. First, name only what is objectively music occurring. Remove prediction, memory, and personal meaning for a few seconds. The message has not been answered. The payment is late. I received criticism. I feel tension in my chest. Notice how different those sentences are from. I am being rejected. I will never have enough. Nobody respects me. Music, or something is wrong with me. The first group describes information. The second group turns information into identity or prophecy. Your mind may have good historical reasons for making that jump, but seeing the jump is important. It shows you that an event and the story surrounding it are not one single thing. Then ask a second question. What does the familiar version of me want to do right now? This is not about judging the answer. You may want to withdraw, argue, over-explain, control, numb yourself, abandon the plan, or seek reassurance. Simply recognize the impulse. That act of recognition creates something neuroscience and psychology take seriously. The possibility of regulating a response instead of expressing it automatically. Neuroplasticity is not the idea that thinking one beautiful thought rewires an entire life. It refers to the nervous system's capacity to change through experience and repeated activity. New responses become meaningful when they are practiced. Music, especially in the situations where older responses once dominated. Now comes the part that connects our discussion of 4D to actual behavior. Instead of searching your past for instructions, music, mentally move forward for a moment. Picture yourself 6 months from now having developed more stability around this particular pattern. Not a perfect version of you. Not someone floating above ordinary problems. A recognizably human version of you who has practiced responding differently many times. What would that person understand about this situation that you are temporarily forgetting? Perhaps they would not send the angry message. Perhaps they would ask a clearer question. Perhaps they would leave the room, regulate their body, return, music, later, or simply accept that uncertainty is present without attempting to eliminate it immediately. This is where imagination earns its place. Its value is not that the universe is obligated to reproduce every scene you visualize. Its value is that the mind can simulate alternatives before action occurs. Athletes use mental rehearsal. Musicians practice internally. People prepare for difficult conversations by imagining possible exchanges. The capacity to represent something that is not currently happening allows us to behave differently when the moment arrives. In the language we have been using, this is one benefit of stepping beyond the authority of the immediate 3D environment. What is visible no longer supplies your only possible response. But there is a third question, and this one reaches toward what we have called the 5D perspective. Can you notice the part of you that is aware of both versions? The old reaction is there. Music. The new possibility is there, and somehow you are able to witness both. You are not required to destroy the old self before choosing differently. In fact, fighting an old pattern often gives it even more attention. You can recognize why it developed, understand what it once protected, and still decide that it no longer deserves control of the next moment. Awareness becomes useful precisely because it can contain contradiction. Fear can be present while you act carefully. Uncertainty can remain while you move forward. The absence of perfect emotion does not mean the absence of choice. This has practical benefits that are far less dramatic than the promises often attached to higher consciousness, but far more valuable. You become harder to manipulate through your own triggers. You recover music more quickly after disappointment because one event does not automatically become a story about your entire life. You become better at distinguishing intuition from anxiety because you start learning the texture of your habitual fears. Relationships can become clearer because you respond more to what another person is actually doing, and less to what someone from your past trained you to expect. Decisions improve because you are no longer asking only what feels familiar, but also what is appropriate now. There is another benefit that is easy to miss. Possibility returns. Chronic patterns narrow perception. When you already know what something means, you stop looking closely. You assume you know how the conversation will end, how people will respond, what you can handle, what is available to you. Once that certainty softens, more information becomes visible. Maybe the person is not rejecting you. Maybe this failure is specific rather than universal. Maybe the boundary you were afraid to set does not destroy the relationship. Maybe the opportunity you dismissed deserves another music look. None of these possibilities require magical thinking. They require enough distance from the old interpretation to investigate reality again. And perhaps that is the most grounded way to understand the movement from 3D to 4D to what spiritual language calls 5D. First you encounter what is happening. Then you recognize that time, memory, imagination, and anticipation expand your relationship with what music is happening. Finally, you become aware of the consciousness interpreting all of it. The point is not to abandon one dimension for another. You still need the physical world. You still need facts, responsibilities, action, music, and discernment. The shift is that none of those facts have to become a prison for identity. Because a circumstance can tell you what has happened, it cannot by itself tell you who you must become next. This becomes especially important in the middle of life, because by then you have accumulated enough evidence to make your identity feel, music, convincing. You have a history with love, work, money, family, health, disappointment, success, music, regret. You know where you tend to hesitate. You know what usually triggers you. You know which dreams you quietly stopped mentioning because they began to feel unrealistic. And after enough years, experience can harden into a sentence. This is just who I am. That sentence sounds mature because it is supported by memory, but sometimes it is only a very well-rehearsed conclusion. Age gives us wisdom, but it can also give our assumptions more authority than they deserve. Maybe that is why this conversation matters so much for people who are no longer 25. Reinvention feels different when you have responsibilities, people depending on you, a body that has lived, relationships with history, and fewer illusions about how unpredictable life can be. You cannot simply throw everything away and call it transformation. Nor should you. Real change at this stage is often quieter. It might mean discovering that you can love someone without abandoning yourself. It might mean changing the way you work after decades of measuring worth through productivity. It could mean admitting that a role you performed beautifully no longer represents who you are. Sometimes the higher perspective is not about adding something extraordinary to life. It is about finally seeing what you have been carrying long after it stopped being necessary. Consider loss. When something meaningful ends, there is no spiritual idea that should be used to erase grief. A higher state of awareness does not mean becoming untouched by pain. But there is a difference between grieving what happened and allowing what happened to define everything that comes after it. The mind often tries to protect us by turning one painful experience into a general law. Never trust that deeply again. Do not risk that much again. Keep your expectations, music low. These conclusions can feel intelligent because they reduce uncertainty. Yet they also reduce the range of life available to us. The wound becomes a filter, and eventually we stop noticing how often we are consulting it. Work creates another version of the same problem. Perhaps you spent 20 years becoming good at something and now feel strangely disconnected from it. The 3D evidence is powerful. Your resume, music, your reputation, your income, other people's expectations, all of it seems to say this is your path. But an identity can remain functional long after it stops feeling alive. The 4D capacity we discussed gives you room to imagine another relationship with your work before you know exactly how to create it. Then the deeper perspective asks whether fear of losing status, certainty, or approval has been disguised as practicality. You may ultimately decide to stay exactly where you are. The difference is that the decision becomes conscious rather than inherited from an earlier version of you. Relationships reveal this even more clearly because another person can activate parts of us that remain invisible when we are alone. You may believe you have become more secure until a certain tone of voice brings back a reaction you have known for 30 years. You may think you have forgiven something until a familiar situation appears and your body, music, responds before your reasoning catches up. This is not proof that you failed. It is information. The relationship has shown you where an old interpretation is still active, and now you have a choice that perhaps you did not have before. Instead of automatically becoming the person who learned that response, you can become curious about what is happening inside you while it is happening. That curiosity may be one of the least dramatic and most powerful forms of change. Why did that affect me so strongly? What am I afraid this means? Is this person actually repeating my past, or did something in the present simply touch it? These questions do not excuse harmful behavior from others. Music. They help you distinguish what needs an external boundary from what needs internal attention. Without that distinction, we can spend years demanding that people stop activating wounds we have never learned to recognize. With it, relationships become clearer because you begin responding to the person in front of you rather than an entire history standing behind them. And then, music. There is the relationship with your own future. At some point you realize that time is no longer an abstract resource. There are things you will not do forever. Music. Certain seasons have already ended. This can produce fear, but it can also produce honesty. The question shifts from what am I supposed to become, music, to what no longer deserves another decade of my life. A resentment, a role, a fear of being misunderstood, an identity built around proving something to people who may not even be watching anymore. The ability to see these patterns without instantly defending them is where our idea of a higher perspective becomes deeply practical. So when you hear people speak about moving from 3D to 4D to 5D, remember what we have actually uncovered here. The usefulness of the language is not in imagining invisible floors of reality that make ordinary life irrelevant. It is in recognizing different levels of relationship with experience. What is happening, what your mind can envision beyond what is happening, and the awareness capable of observing both without being completely imprisoned by either. Because eventually, music, the most important question is no longer whether you can access another dimension. It is whether you can meet the life already in front of you without automatically becoming the person you used to be. So now we can return to the sentence we began with. Music. Ignore the 3D mental reality. It sounds very different after everything we have explored. It was never an invitation to deny the world in front of you. Music. It was an invitation to stop confusing the world in front of you with the total range of what you can become. Three-dimensional space gives structure to the physical environment we move through. Music. Relativity adds time to that picture through spacing. Human consciousness adds another layer entirely. Memory, imagination, anticipation, meaning, identity. And when spiritual language speaks about 4D or 5D, it often uses those terms symbolically to describe changes in perception rather than literal destinations in physics. Once those meanings are separated, something useful remains. You can respect facts without surrendering your entire identity to them. That distinction becomes important because your current life contains evidence of many things. But it does not contain evidence of everything you are capable of learning, choosing, creating, repairing, or becoming. A photograph captures what was in front of the camera at one instant. It does not contain the next movement. Your present circumstances work in a similar way. They reveal conditions. They show consequences. Sometimes they reveal patterns that need to be faced with complete honesty. But they cannot automatically predict how you will respond when the next decision arrives. That part remains unfinished. And perhaps this is where people misunderstand transformation. They wait for a completely different feeling, a completely different life, some unmistakable internal sign that says they are finally ready. Very often, nothing announces the change. There is simply an ordinary situation in which you notice that the old response is available, music, and you no longer want to choose it. Maybe the higher dimension you were looking for was never somewhere above this one. Maybe it begins when you can see your circumstances, your memories, your fears, and your imagined future without allowing any single one of them to become the entire landscape. You become able to hold more than one truth at once. Something can music, hurt, and still not define you. You can be uncertain and still make a thoughtful decision. You can acknowledge what happened without building your remaining years around it. You can want something deeply without turning desire into desperation. This does not make life easier in every moment. It makes your relationship with life less automatic. And that brings us back to the music observer. Not the quantum observer used casually as proof that thought controls matter, but the human observer capable of noticing what is happening internally. The quality of that observation matters. If every setback immediately becomes evidence of inadequacy, then perception narrows. If every delay becomes catastrophe, the future is being interpreted before it arrives. If every difficult emotion is treated as something that must disappear before you can move, your own inner weather begins determining the direction of your life. But when awareness becomes more spacious, you can say, "This is what I am feeling. This is what I am seeing. And I do not yet know everything this music means." There is enormous freedom inside those last few words. For the next few days, you might experiment with one question. Whenever something pulls you strongly into an old reaction, ask, "What am I treating as final right now?" Do not rush to answer. Maybe you are treating another person's opinion as final. Maybe you are treating an age, a diagnosis, an error, a financial season, a rejection, or a memory as final. Perhaps you are treating your own fear as final evidence that you should not proceed. Then look again, not to manufacture a happier story, but to see whether reality contains more room than your first interpretation allowed. Sometimes the wise response will be acceptance, sometimes action, sometimes a boundary, sometimes patience. The purpose is not to force one answer. Music. It is to stop letting an unconscious pattern answer before you have even entered the conversation. If this exploration has opened something you want to take further, I created a deeper path around these ideas in the ebook Awaken Your Quantum Shift. It is for those who want to continue exploring quantum spirituality, consciousness, identity, and the inner work behind changing the way we relate to reality. You will find the link in the first pinned comment below the music video. Take a look at it in your own time and decide for yourself whether it belongs in this part of your journey. And if conversations like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel. Not because we have simple answers for consciousness, but because some questions deserve more than a 30-second explanation. Share this video with 5 people you believe would genuinely appreciate this conversation. And before you leave, write me an honest comment. Tell me what part challenged the way you think, what part you disagree with, or what became clearer. Then tell me the subject you would like us to explore in the next video. Those comments help shape where this conversation goes next. For years, you may have looked at your life and asked, reality to tell you who you are. Perhaps reality was never qualified to answer that question. It could only show you where you had been.